The fog hadn't lifted yet when Daniel Mercer stepped outside. Wood was just past 6, the kind of morning where the air feels thick and the tree line along the back of his property disappears into gray. He had a cup of coffee in his hand. He wasn't looking for anything. He never was at that hour. He just wanted quiet. He almost missed it entirely. There was a shape near the tree line, low to the ground, dark. His first thought was a dog, maybe one of the neighbors that wandered too far. He squinted. The shape moved. Then it stopped. Then slowly it turned toward him. Daniel set his coffee down on the porch rail. That was not a dog. He didn't move. Not right away. His brain was doing what brains do when they see something that doesn't fit, cycling through every possibility, landing on none of them. The shape was small, maybe 2 feet tall, dark fur almost black. It was crouched low, weight forward, knuckles pressed into the wet grass at the edge of his yard where the lawn meets the woods. A baby gorilla, standing on his property, alone, at 6 in the morning. Daniel had lived on this land for 22 years. He'd seen deer, foxes, a black bear once that wandered down from the ridge and helped itself to his trash. He had never not once seen anything like this. Everything wild runs. It's the first and most reliable rule of nature. You get too close, it disappears. But this one just stood there, watching him with dark eyes that caught the early light, and it did not move. Daniel took one step forward. The gorilla flinched, a small pull backward, shoulders rising, but it held its ground. Something about that detail stopped him cold. A wild animal that flinches but doesn't flee. That's not confidence. That's not aggression. That's something else entirely. That's exhaustion. He stayed where he was, just watching, trying to figure out what he was actually looking at and, more importantly, what he was supposed to do about it. His land sat at the edge of a wildlife corridor in rural North Carolina, the kind of place where the trees went back for miles, and the state managed a conservation stretch not far to the east. But gorillas didn't live in North Carolina. Gorillas didn't live anywhere near North Carolina. They weren't native to this continent at all, which meant this animal had come from somewhere else, which meant something had gone very wrong. The cub shifted its weight. In the growing light, Daniel could see it more clearly now, and what he saw tightened something in his chest. The fur along its left side was matted and uneven. One hand, when it lifted briefly from the ground, looked swollen around the knuckles. It was thin, not just small, but thin in the way that means the body has been spending more than it's been taking in. It was breathing, but it was working to do it. Daniel thought, this animal will not survive another night alone. He went inside, didn't slam the door, didn't rush. Moving slowly around something injured and afraid is the first instinct most people forget. But Daniel had grown up around animals his whole life, and the instinct was still there. He went to the kitchen, opened the refrigerator, and pulled out what he had. Some apple slices left over from the night before, a banana, a handful of grapes. He came back outside and crouched down about 15 feet from where the cub stood. He set the fruit on the ground in front of him, then leaned back and waited. Nothing happened for a long time, long enough that his knees started to ache, long enough that the fog began burning off in patches, and the morning started to look like morning again. The cub watched him the entire time, not blinking much, just watching the way animals do when they're calculating something, when they're deciding whether the thing in front of them is a threat or a possibility. Then it moved forward. 1 step, stop. 2 steps, stop. A slow, crooked path toward the fruit, keeping its eyes on Daniel the entire time, ready to bolt at the slightest wrong move. It reached the apple slices first. It sniffed them, looked up at him, looked back down, and it ate. Daniel didn't speak, didn't reach out, didn't do anything except breathe steadily and let the moment be what it was. But inside, a question was forming that he couldn't quite push away. Where is her mother? Gorillas don't abandon their young. That's not an opinion, it's one of the most well-documented facts about the species. Gorilla mothers are among the most attentive in the animal kingdom. They carry their infants for months, nurse them for years, keep them within arm's reach almost constantly until they're old enough to move on their own. An infant this size, this young, would not be alone by choice, not the mother's choice, and not the cub's, which meant the mother wasn't coming back. Daniel looked out at the tree line while the cub ate. The forest beyond his property was dense, old-growth hardwood mostly, and completely still. No movement, no sound except birds. Whatever troop this animal had come from, and she must have come from somewhere, must have been someone's, it wasn't nearby, or if it wasn't calling for her. The silence felt heavy in a way that was hard to explain. He watched her eat the last of the grapes and then sit back, small chest rising and falling. She looked up at him, just for a second. Then she looked away, out toward the trees, and something passed across her face that looked, and Daniel knew this was probably just him projecting, probably just his own mind filling in a story, but something passed across her face that looked exactly like uncertainty. He wasn't going to do that. Even in the grip of whatever this strange morning had become, he understood the line between helping and making things worse. She was a wild animal. She needed to return to the wild. Anything else was just sentiment dressed up as kindness. What he did instead was practical, measured, he told himself. He cleared out a corner of his covered back porch, laid down some old moving blankets he kept in the garage, and filled a shallow bowl with fresh water. He put out more fruit. He left the porch light off so it wouldn't attract other animals or make the space feel too exposed. Then he went inside and called a wildlife rehabilitator he'd spoken to once years ago about an injured hawk. He left a message. He called the state wildlife agency and got a recording. He tried 2 more numbers and reached people who were polite but clearly unsure what to do with a man reporting a baby gorilla in his backyard in North Carolina. By late afternoon, he had a few callbacks scheduled for the next morning and no immediate help coming. He looked out the kitchen window. The cub had moved onto the porch. She was curled in the corner he'd prepared, half inside the blankets watching the yard. He stood there for a while, just looking at her, thinking about the phone calls, thinking about the troop that wasn't in those trees, thinking about how none of this was supposed to happen. Then he made sure the water bowl was full and went to make dinner. The next 3 days were quiet. He kept his distance. He put food out in the same spot each morning and watched from just inside the sliding glass door as she came for it. She was eating more now, moving a little better. The swelling in her hands seemed to be going down, though he was no veterinarian. He kept detailed notes, wrote down what she ate, how she moved, whether she seemed to favor one side. He had no idea if those notes would be useful to anyone. It felt better than doing nothing. She started waiting for him. That was the part he noticed first. Not the eating or the slow improvement in her movement, but the waiting. Each morning before he opened the back door, if he looked through the window, she was already there, already watching the door, like she'd worked out the schedule, like she knew. On the 4th morning, when he came out and crouched down to set her food out, she didn't back up. She just watched him, 3 feet away, and waited for him to finish. And when he set the bowl down and started to stand, she reached out, just briefly, not quite touching his hand but close enough that he felt the air between them change, and then she pulled back and started to eat. Daniel stayed crouched for a long time after that, thinking about what that gesture meant in a language he didn't fully speak, thinking about how in all the reading he'd done over the past 4 days about gorilla behavior and infant development and troop dynamics, nobody had quite described this. This wasn't just survival. He knew what survival looked like. He'd seen plenty of animals accept help out of pure necessity and nothing else. This was something different. He just wasn't sure yet what to call it. It was on the 5th night that he woke up, not because of a noise exactly, more like the absence of one. His house sat far enough from the road that it was usually very quiet at night, and he'd gotten used to that quiet over 2 decades. When something changed in it even slightly, some part of him registered it before the rest of him was awake. He lay still for a moment, listening. Then he got up and walked to the window that faced the backyard. The porch light was off. The yard was dark except for the pale cast of a half moon. He could see the porch, the blanket in the corner, the cub's small shape curled there just as he'd left her when he checked before bed. But beyond the porch, at the edge of the yard, where the grass ended and the first trees began, something was there. He couldn't make out a shape, just a stillness that was different from the stillness of trees, a darkness that was thicker than shadow. And then very slowly it moved. And then it was gone. Daniel stood at the window for a long time. The yard was empty. The forest was still. The cub hadn't moved. Everything was exactly as it should have been. Except it wasn't. Because something had been out there. Something that had come to the edge of his yard and stood in the dark and watched the porch or the cub or him. He couldn't say which. And then quietly, without any sound at all, had slipped back into the trees. He didn't sleep again that night. And in the morning when the sun came up and he went to the back door and looked out, the cub was awake too, sitting upright, facing not the house, not the food bowl but the tree line, like she was waiting for something to come back. Weeks passed, and something shifted. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't happen in a single moment. It was the kind of change that only becomes visible in hindsight, the way you don't notice a plant growing until one day it's simply taller than it was. Daniel would look at her in the morning and think, she's stronger than yesterday. Then a week later he'd think the same thing and realize he'd been thinking it every day without adding it up. She was thriving. The swelling in her hand had disappeared completely by the 2nd week. She moved without favoring any side. She'd started climbing, first the porch railing, then the old oak that grew close enough to the house that its lower branches hung over the roof. She'd sit up there for long stretches, perfectly still, watching the yard below with an expression that Daniel had come to recognize as simple contentment. He'd started calling her Rue. He hadn't planned to. It just happened the way these things do, quietly and without announcement, until one morning he said it out loud and it was already the only name she'd ever had. She learned his routines faster than he expected. When his alarm went off at 6, she was already on the porch. When he came outside with her food at 1:30, she was waiting exactly where she always waited, not at the bowl but 3 feet behind it, letting him set things down before she approached. When he sat in the old wooden chair at the end of the porch in the evenings, she would settle nearby, not touching him, but close enough that he was aware of her warmth. One afternoon he was repairing a section of fence along the side yard, hammer in hand, working slowly in the October heat. He turned around and she was sitting 5 feet behind him, watching. He went back to work. 20 minutes later, he heard a sound, a small rhythmic knocking, and turned to find her striking a stick against the fence post in a loose imitation of what he'd been doing. He stood there and watched her for a long moment. Then he laughed, a real one, the kind that surprised him. She looked up when he laughed, tilted her head, and something in her eyes carried what he could only describe as satisfaction. But underneath all of it, there was a current Daniel couldn't ignore. He knew what she was. He knew what she needed. The wildlife rehabilitator he'd finally reached had been clear, warm but clear. Rue needed to be with her own kind. A young gorilla bonding this deeply with a human was not a neutral thing. The longer it continued, the harder the separation would become. For her especially, but honestly, the woman had said gently, for him too. Daniel knew she was right. He'd known it since the first morning. Knowing something and being ready for it are two entirely different things. He woke one Tuesday in November to silence. Not the usual silence. Something in it was different. He felt it before he was fully awake, the same way he'd felt the watcher in the trees that first night. Not a sound, but the shape of a sound that should have been there and wasn't. He went to the back door. The bowl was untouched. The blanket was empty. The porch held nothing but cold morning air. He went outside and called her name, walked the yard, checked the oak tree, walked the fence line, called again. Nothing. No tracks he could follow. No signs of struggle. No indication that anything had happened at all. She was simply gone. He searched for 3 days. He called the rehabilitator. He walked the tree line until his boots were soaked through. He drove the back roads and checked with 2 neighbors and filed a report he felt faintly ridiculous filing. Silence answered everything. Months passed. The bowl stayed on the porch. He told himself he'd left it there to remind himself to put it away. He never put it away. Then on a gray morning in late February, something appeared at the edge of the trees again, larger this time, much larger. And it wasn't alone. Daniel didn't move. He was standing at the kitchen window with his second cup of coffee, the same way he'd stood on 100 mornings since November, sometimes still half expecting to see something small and dark waiting by the bowl. What he saw instead made him set the cup down very carefully, the way you do when your hands have suddenly become uncertain. There were 2 of them at the tree line. One was large, full-grown or close to it. The other was smaller, hanging slightly back, half obscured by the low branches at the forest's edge. The large one stood in the open, shoulders square, watching the house with the kind of stillness that isn't passive, it's deliberate. It's a choice. Daniel's first instinct was to step back from the window. His second instinct, the one he listened to, was to stay completely still. He watched. They watched. The morning held its breath. Then the large one took 3 steps forward into the yard. He went to the back door and opened it slowly, stood in the frame, kept his hands visible, his posture low, everything his body knew to do around animals that could read threat in a shoulder angle or a direct stare. The gorilla stopped when the door opened, assessed him, and then, and this was the moment Daniel felt something unlock in his chest that he hadn't realized was closed, she tilted her head, exactly the way Ruse used to tilt her head. He said her name quietly, just once. She didn't react to the word, but she took another step forward, and something in the way she moved was so familiar, so completely specific to her, that there was no question left in him at all. It was her. She'd grown enormously. The lean, fragile animal he'd nursed through those first careful weeks was gone entirely. In her place was something powerful and composed, moving with the easy confidence of an animal that belonged fully to its world. She was healthy. She was whole. Daniel stood very still and let himself look at her, and he was not embarrassed by how much that meant to him. She came within 10 feet and stopped. They regarded each other for a long moment. No aggression, no anxiety. Just 2 creatures who had shared something unusual, recognizing each other across the distance that had grown between them. Then she turned and looked back toward the trees. The smaller gorilla at the edge stepped out slightly. Then another shape emerged, and another. Slowly, without urgency, a small group materialized from the shadows. 4, then 5 individuals ranging from nearly adult down to one that was very young, moving close to an older female. Daniel counted them without meaning to, his brain making notes while the rest of him was still catching up to what he was seeing. Rue had a troop. She had found her way back to her kind, or they had found her, and now she was here with all of them, standing in his yard on a gray February morning, and he had absolutely no framework for what that meant. He noticed the older female first. She was moving differently from the others, slower, one arm held at an angle that looked wrong. The others gave her space in a way that wasn't casual. It was the specific, attentive space a group gives something that needs it. Daniel stepped off the porch. Rue watched him come forward. She didn't retreat. She turned her body slightly, orienting herself between him and the older female, and the meaning of that gesture, he was certain he wasn't imagining it, was unmistakable. She wasn't showing him her troop. She was showing him the one who needed help. The older female was sitting now, cradling her left arm against her body. Even from 15 feet away, Daniel could see the unnatural angle. Something was broken or close to it. The female's eyes were half closed. Her breathing was shallow and deliberate, the kind of breathing that means pain has become routine. The rest of the group had gone quiet. Rue looked at Daniel, then at the female, then back at Daniel. He understood. He went inside and picked up the phone. The wildlife rehabilitator arrived within 2 hours. Her name was Carol Sims, and she'd been working with primates for over 30 years. Daniel had spoken to her enough times by phone that her voice was familiar, but seeing her step out of the truck, calm, unhurried, reading the yard before she'd taken 3 steps, he understood immediately why she was the person you called. She stopped beside him and looked at the group without speaking for a long moment. "She brought them to you," Carol said. "It wasn't a question." "Looks that way," Daniel said. Carol watched Rue, who was sitting near the older female, monitoring everything with quiet attention. "That's not something you see," she said quietly. "I want to be clear with you. In 30 years, that is not something I have seen." They worked slowly. Carol made a call, and a wildlife veterinarian named Dr. O.C. arrived an hour later with equipment and the particular brand of focused calm that emergency medicine produces in people who are good at it. They set up at the far edge of the yard, well back from the group, and did everything at a pace designed to communicate the opposite of threat. Rue watched every move they made. She didn't approach Carol or Dr. Ose. She stayed between the group and the humans, not blocking, not aggressive, just present, witnessing. The rest of the troop took their cues from her, and because she remained calm, they remained calm. It was as clear a demonstration of trust as Daniel had ever watched one creature extend to another. The injured female, Dr. Ose would later confirm a fracture in the lower left forearm, likely from a fall, was sedated carefully and treated on site. The procedure took the better part of an afternoon. Daniel stayed at the edge of the porch and mostly stayed out of the way, which was, Carol told him, exactly the right thing to do. By evening, the older female was resting comfortably. The fracture stabilized, pain managed. The troop had settled at the tree line, close enough to stay connected, far enough to maintain their own space. Rue sat near the recovering female, occasionally touching her shoulder with the back of one hand, a slow, deliberate gesture that Carol watched with an expression Daniel couldn't quite read. "She's checking on her," Carol said. "Is that normal?" Daniel asked. Carol considered the question seriously. "The behavior is normal. The context is not." She paused. She knew the female needed help. She knew where to bring her. She knew you were safe. Another pause. Those are 3 separate things she had to hold together. Daniel looked out at Rue in the fading light. "She held them together," he said. Over the following weeks, Carol coordinated with a regional primate sanctuary and a wildlife team to monitor the group as they transitioned back into the deeper forest. The older female healed steadily. The troop stayed within the corridor, moving naturally, gradually ranging further as the weeks passed. Carol checked in every few days, and her updates had the quiet satisfaction of someone watching something go right. Daniel went back to his routines, fixed the fence, drank his coffee in the mornings. The bowl stayed on the porch, though he told himself now it was simply part of the furniture. It was a Thursday morning, ordinary in every respect, when he saw her one last time. He was at the kitchen window. The yard was empty, the tree line still, the light flat and pale the way March light is before the season commits to anything. He almost didn't register the movement. But there she was, just at the edge, just for a moment. She stood at the border between his world and hers, and she looked at the house with those dark, familiar eyes, not waiting for anything, not asking for anything, just looking, the way you look at something you are choosing to remember. Then she turned and walked into the trees, and the forest, quietly, took her back. Daniel stood at the window for a long time after she was gone. The yard held nothing but morning light, and the particular stillness that follows something that mattered. He thought about what Carol had said, about the three things Rue had held together, about a young animal, alone and exhausted at the edge of his yard, making a decision that neither of them fully understood at the time. Some debts don't get repaid in kind, they get repaid in trust, in the willingness to return to the place where you were once most vulnerable, and to bring with you everything you've become. The bowl sat on the porch railing. Daniel left it there,